The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like distant rotor blades, and Katie Morrison's hands moved through the 4 stations with the kind of precision that no one noticed because no one was looking. Third shift at Oak Creek Memorial. 6:30 in the morning. The ICU corridors smelled like antiseptic and something underneath it, the copper tang of blood mixed with floor wax, and she breathed through her mouth the way she'd learned to do in Helmand Province when the smell of diesel fuel and cordite got too thick to bear. Her name tag read simply K. Morrison, RN. 3 years of invisibility. 3 years of refilling bags, checking drips, documenting vitals with meticulous precision that made her a contradiction. A woman whom nurses avoided in the break room somehow produced the most complete charting in the hospital. No one asked why. No one cared. That was the point. She hung a new liter of normal saline on the 4-pole in room 342, her fingers moving to the patient's wrist before she consciously decided to check. Radial pulse. 68 beats per minute. Rhythm steady. The old man didn't wake, didn't acknowledge her, and Katie withdrew her hand like she'd never been there. 3 seconds per patient. That was her standard. 3 seconds to assess what the monitors might miss. 3 seconds to check the things that machines got wrong. The scar on her left side pulled slightly when she turned toward the hallway. It ran from her ear to her collarbone, thin, white, visible only when the light caught it at certain angles. Most people didn't notice. The ones who did never asked. Katie had learned early on that if you didn't make eye contact and moved with enough purpose, people assumed you belonged wherever you were. In a hospital, a woman with a clipboard and scrubs was as invisible as a shadow on the wall. She was restocking the supply cart outside room 347 when the patient transport arrived. 2 EMTs. A stretcher. The portable ventilator hissed its mechanical rhythm as they wheeled past, and Katie's hand stilled for half a second. Not long enough for anyone to notice. Not long enough for the tremor to translate into anything visible. The man on the stretcher was unconscious. Severe blast injuries, she heard one of the EMTs say to Dr. Chen, the ICU resident. Training accident. Respiratory compromise. Multiple contusions to the thorax. Katie kept her eyes on the supply inventory on her cart, saline flushes, alcohol prep pads, sterile gauze in organized rows, and counted her breaths the way her therapist had taught her. In for 4. Hold for 4. Out for 4. But then he spoke, and Katie's clipboard slipped from her fingers and clattered against the tile with a sound like a gunshot in the quiet morning. Captain Reeves, Dr. Chen was saying. Navy pilot out of North Island. Ejection seat malfunction during a carrier qualifications maneuver. Katie's vision narrowed. She reached down for the clipboard with careful, deliberate movements, her hand steady now. Muscle memory. Years of training to keep the external presentation stable while everything internal fractured. She straightened, clipboard secured, and allowed her eyes to drift toward the stretcher as it passed through the ICU doors. His left forearm was exposed where the 4 line had been placed. A tattoo. Faded but unmistakable. Block letters in military black ink. A last name and a date. Morrison, Helmand 2012. Katie's breath caught somewhere in her throat, but she didn't freeze. She didn't stop moving. She turned back to her supply cart and began recounting bandages she'd already counted, her fingers moving with automatic precision. 12 years. She could see it perfectly, the dust of Sanjin Valley coating everything, the weight of a man's body against her shoulder as she'd hauled him out of the firefight, his collapsed lung hissing like a kettle as she'd performed the needle decompression right there in the dust with a 14-gauge angiocath and her own hands the only steady thing in a world that had come apart. He hadn't been conscious then either. She'd managed his airway, controlled the bleed, got him to the bird. And then she'd disappeared into the chaos of the next casualty and the next, until there were no more, and the rest of her tour had been paperwork and debriefing and the slow realization that she couldn't sleep anymore without hearing the rotor wash in her dreams. She moved into room 347. The captain lay motionless on the hospital bed, the ventilator tube secured at the corner of his mouth, his chest rising and falling in the mechanical rhythm of the machine. His face had weathered in 12 years, deeper lines around the eyes, a scar along his left temple that hadn't been there before. But the bone structure was the same. The shape of him. She'd kept his weight on her shoulders for 3 miles through terrain that tried to kill her every step. Katie checked his vitals. Oxygen saturation 94%. Heart rate elevated but consistent. Blood pressure low but holding. Everything a fresh post-operative patient would show. She made notes in his chart with the kind of careful attention to detail that Dr. Hargrove had begun to notice, though she hadn't yet realized he was watching. He entered room 347 approximately 90 seconds after Katie had begun her assessment. Dr. Hargrove moved through the hospital corridors like a man who owned them, shoulder first, presence that made the air pressure change, voice modulated to convey just the right mixture of authority and congeniality. 54 years old. $500,000 in unmarked billing adjustments this fiscal year. Connections that ran from the hospital board down through 3 surgical equipment suppliers and back up again through a brother-in-law who managed the state medical licensing committee. He did not look at Katie. He looked at Captain Reeves and made a sound that suggested professional concern. He reviewed the chart with the same expression of mild interest he reserved for most administrative tasks, turning pages with the casual disinterest of a man who had delegated his actual concern to subordinates years ago. Blast injuries, Dr. Hargrove said. It was not a question. He was reading the summary line. Respiratory compromise. Intubated in transport. Yes, Katie answered. She kept her voice level. Neutral. The voice of a woman who had no business in this conversation but had been asked a direct question. Bilateral breath sounds present. Sinus rhythm maintained throughout transport. Vital stable since arrival. Dr. Hargrove turned his head toward her. It was the kind of turn that suggested he'd just noticed a piece of medical equipment he wasn't familiar with. His eyes moved over her name tag, her face, and settled with the faint precision of a calculator recognizing a variable. The charge nurse didn't complete this assessment, he said. He was holding the chart now, reading the documentation. Katie's documentation. Her meticulous notes about oxygen levels and lung expansion and the small details that suggested the patient's condition was better maintained than protocol usually allowed. Who admits post-operative trauma? The charge nurse was managing the code in room 344, Katie said. She had moved back to the 4 stand, positioning herself at the periphery of the room the way she'd learned to do. Visible but not intrusive. Captain Reeves arrived concurrent with the arrest. Dr. Hargrove turned a page. Then another. Katie watched the angle of his jaw shift, the smallest tightening at the hinge. Your notes are remarkably detailed for a nurse who refills bags. It wasn't quite an insult. It wasn't quite a compliment. It was the kind of observation that hung in the air like a question mark, waiting to see if she would defend herself or disappear back into invisibility. Katie's hands, which had been checking the 4 drip rate, stilled for exactly 1 breath. I assess while I'm present, she said. He closed the chart. That's something we might discuss with the unit director. Scope of practice. Where are Captain Reeves' surgical orders? Room 347 pending neurology consult. No orthopedic intervention planned until cognitive status improves. Another pause. Dr. Hargrove's gaze moved across the monitor, the ventilator, the carefully arranged medications and equipment. Everything in its place. Everything accounted for. Everything suggesting that the woman who had set it up knew exactly what she was doing, and that knowledge presented a small but growing problem for a man whose primary skill had become the art of obscuring what he was actually doing from people paying close enough attention. Notify me when he's extubated, he said. I want to examine him personally before discharge planning begins. Yes, doctor. He left. Katie waited exactly 30 seconds, then excused herself from the room. She moved back to the supply cart in the hallway and began the process of restocking everything exactly as it had been before, her movements automatic now. Practiced. The way your body learned to function when your mind had stopped thinking about the present tense and started processing everything 3 or 4 steps ahead. That was when the helicopter flew overhead. The rotor blades came through the hospital windows like a physical force, that distinctive percussion sound that Katie's nervous system had learned to associate with either rescue or fire missions, or sometimes both simultaneously. Her hands jerked on the box of gauze pads she was holding. The box fell. Sterile packages scattered across the tile floor in a precise pattern that would take 12 minutes to clean up and replace. She was on her knees before she made the conscious decision to kneel, gathering the packages back into the box with hands that had started to shake. Her jaw clenched. Her breathing had gone shallow. Outside, the helicopter completed its approach, probably a med flight incoming, critical transfer from somewhere inland, and the rotor wash faded gradually into the ambient noise of the hospital machinery and the early morning traffic on the 5 outside. Katie steadied her hands against the supply cart. The tremor was not visible to anyone watching. She'd learned years ago that PTSD didn't announce itself in loud or obvious ways if you had the discipline to manage it. It manifested in small things. The way your hands moved. The way you counted your breaths. The way you could be in a hospital room with a man you'd risked your life for and stand perfectly still while your nervous system fought the phantom sensation of dust and heat and the weight of decisions made in seconds. 12 years. He'd been on her shoulders for 3 miles. His blood had been on her hands, which were now steady enough to place a new box of gauze pads onto a hospital supply cart like nothing had happened. She looked back toward room 347. Through the small window in the door, she could see the monitor, the ventilator, the still form of Captain Reeves. His name. Her name tattooed on his arm. A connection that existed only in her memory and on his skin, and his memory was gone, erased by the force that had nearly killed him in a maneuver that made no sense to her, in a context she would never fully understand. She picked up the clipboard and made a note about the new patient admission, her handwriting precise and small. 3 years of practice at being invisible. 3 years of standing in hospital corridors watching people's lives unfold on monitors and machines while her own life was carefully archived in a locker downstairs, wrapped in flags she'd learned not to display. Somewhere above her, Dr. Hargrove was already reviewing the surgical supply orders that didn't quite match the patient census, already wondering what a nurse with assessment skills that precise was doing in an entry-level ICU position, already calculating the threat level of someone who could see exactly what he'd been doing for the past 6 years. Neither of them knew what was about to break open. Not yet. Outside room 347, the hallway smelled of antiseptic and something else, the particular staleness of a hospital corridor at shift change, where 2 worlds collided in the span of seconds. Dr. Hargrove stood with his arms crossed, his white coat pristine, pressed, worth more than Katie Morrison's monthly rent. Behind him, Captain Reeves' daughter Sarah had just arrived from Annapolis, still in her dress uniform, navy blue sharp as a blade. She didn't know yet that her father had a medic's name tattooed on his forearm in Helmand Province script. She didn't know that the woman in the faded scrubs had carried him 3 miles through enemy fire with a collapsed lung while rounds tore into the sand around them both. Katie was checking her medication log when Dr. Hargrove's voice cut through the ambient hospital noise like a scalpel finding skin. "Nurse Morrison, can you explain something?" The way he said her name made it sound like an accusation. She looked up from her tablet, met his eyes. "Doctor?" Captain Reeves received his pain medication at 08:03 this morning. "I have documentation that indicates it was 17 minutes late." His voice carried. Deliberately. The kind of volume that made nurses 3 rooms down suddenly very interested in their work. "That's a significant deviation from protocol. Can you explain the delay?" Katie pulled up the medication administration record. Her hands didn't shake. They never did, not in daylight, not when people were watching. The trembling came later, in the parking lot, in the dark of her apartment at 3 in the morning. "Doctor, I administered dilaudid 2 milligrams for at exactly 08:43. The timestamp is documented in the electronic record. The previous dose was scheduled for 0600. There was no delay. Are you calling me a liar?" His voice dropped, which was worse than if it had gotten louder. Controlled anger always was. In front of this family. Sarah Reeves shifted her weight. Her uniform caught the fluorescent light, and Katie saw her father in the set of her jaw, that particular Naval Academy confidence that came from generations of people who didn't question their own authority. "I'm not calling you anything, Doctor. I'm stating what the record shows." "The record shows what you wrote." Dr. Hargrove stepped closer, invading the space where professional distance became personal territory. "And frankly, Nurse Morrison, this is exactly the kind of sloppy, insubordinate nursing that gets patients killed. You know what I call you in the morning meetings? The clipboard queen. Always writing, always documenting, always too busy with your precious notes to do actual patient care." The fluorescent lights hummed their electric frequency. Somewhere down the hall, a monitor beeped. The room temperature seemed to drop 5 degrees in the space between heartbeats. Katie took one measured breath. The kind of breath taught in combat medicine training, the kind that steadied hands before surgery, before crisis, before anything that required precision. She felt a single tear escape down her left cheek, the kind that came not from emotion but from the pressure of holding too much inside for too long. She didn't look away as she wiped it. Her voice, when it came, sounded like still water, the kind of calm that comes not from peace but from having already survived the worst. "I've seen what real failure looks like, Doctor. I've seen it in a hospital tent in Helmand Province where we ran out of blood products at 0300 and had to choose which soldiers got fluids and which ones didn't. This isn't it." The silence was absolute. Even the monitors seemed to hold their breath. Dr. Hargrove's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being contradicted. More than that, he wasn't used to being seen, truly seen, by someone he'd categorized as invisible. His eyes narrowed, calculating, the look of a man recalibrating his strategy. He turned to Sarah Reeves with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Your father is in excellent hands. Some of our finest staff." He nodded at Katie as he said it, a gesture that somehow made it sound like an insult. Then he walked away, his expensive shoes clicking against the linoleum tile in a rhythm that sounded like a countdown. Katie finished her shift with the kind of mechanical precision that came from muscle memory. Check vitals. Document. Move to the next patient. The night consumed her in its quiet urgency, the ventilator's rhythmic hiss, the soft alarm of a pulse oximeter, the gentle crackle of plastic for tubing. By the time morning broke over San Diego's eastern horizon, painting the hospital windows in shades of amber and rust, she felt hollowed out. The break room at 1,130 hours was full, 8 nurses scattered across 3 tables, the smell of microwaved coffee and someone's sad desk lunch filling the small space. Katie unwrapped her sandwich, turkey and mustard on wheat from the staff cafe, and sat at the table by the window that overlooked the parking lot. She set her lunch down and reached for her water bottle. One by one, they stood. Markers from the night shift. Jennifer, who worked the pediatric wing. A per diem nurse she'd never actually spoken to. Tom, who she'd helped train on the new cardiac monitor system 2 months ago. They gathered their things with the kind of deliberate slowness that suggested coordination, that suggested this wasn't coincidence but choreography. "Got to get back," Marker said, not meeting her eyes. "Forgot I had an errand," Jennifer offered to no one in particular. Within 90 seconds, the break room was empty except for Katie and the ghost of their presence, the still warm coffee cups, the faint echo of conversations that had died the moment she sat down. The fluorescent lights buzzed their mechanical song. Outside, a siren wailed past on the street below, growing distant, growing smaller, until it was just the hum of refrigeration and the sound of Katie's own breathing. She picked up her sandwich and took one bite. The bread was dry. She couldn't taste the mustard. She put it down and sat for the remaining 23 minutes of her break with her hands folded on the table, watching the parking lot, watching the sun move across the sky, watching time move in a direction that felt like punishment. When she returned to the ICU, the message was already posted. The unit board sat at the main hallway entrance, where every staff member passed multiple times per shift, where families and visitors and hospital administrators could see it. The paper was white and official, printed on hospital letterhead, and it was positioned at eye level where no one could miss it. Katie Morrison, RN. Written warning for insubordination and failure to follow protocol. Further incidents will result in termination. Her name in capital letters, her violation documented in 12-point font, her future articulated in a single sentence. Dr. Hargrove's signature was precise, almost calligraphic, the signature of a man who'd learned to make everything look beautiful, even destruction. She read it during shift change, surrounded by the flow of incoming and outgoing staff who suddenly found the floor fascinating, the ceiling tiles interesting, anywhere but her face. She reached up and touched the corner of the paper once, her fingers barely brushing the edge, then lowered her hand and walked to the supply room. The supply room at Oak Creek Memorial was a cave of white shelves and fluorescent light, floor-to-ceiling inventory organized by someone with OCD and a Sharpie. Gauze in one section. Tape in another. Sutures, syringes, saline bags arranged in ascending order like soldiers at attention. Katie stood in front of the gauze section and began counting. 4x4 sterile gauze pads. Box of 50. There were 6 boxes on the shelf. She counted, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Then she started again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Her hands had finally started to shake. Not from fear, the trembling was something else entirely, the kind that came from holding too much tension in muscles trained not to break, not to yield, not to show anything to anyone ever. The gauze pad swam in front of her vision. She blinked once, hard, forced her breathing back into rhythm. Combat breathing. 4 counts in, hold for 7, 8 counts out. The Tactical Combat Casualty Care course had taught her that in 2006, and some lessons never left your body, even when you tried to bury them under 3 years of invisibility and scrubs the color of surrender. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she could hear the machinery of Dr. Hargrove's design clicking into place like a weapon being assembled. That written warning wasn't just documentation, it was stage 2 of a calculated escalation. He'd established a narrative. He'd isolated her. He'd documented her as a liability. The next step would be obvious: make sure nobody defended her. Make sure nobody believed her. Make sure that when the moment came, when the real crisis arrived, she would be alone. Katie counted the gauze pads again. 4 counts in, 7 count hold, 8 counts out. She didn't know that Captain Reeves was running a low-grade fever that night. She didn't know that his lungs were filling with fluid from the pneumonia that had been developing for 72 hours beneath his stable vital signs. She didn't know that at 0237 his oxygen saturation would begin to plummet, that his monitor would alarm, that she would have exactly 4 minutes to choose between protocol and physics, between obedience and the particular violence that saved lives. She didn't know that Dr. Hargrove would be watching from the doorway. But her hands knew. Her body knew. The part of her that had been trained to make impossible choices under impossible pressure knew, and it was already preparing itself for what came next. She finished counting the gauze and walked back to the ICU. The night shift had begun. Captain Reeves was still asleep, his chest rising and falling, his name tattooed on a woman he no longer recognized. She checked his vitals, documented everything perfectly, and waited. The night shift at Oak Creek Memorial moved like a slow for drip, fluid but relentless. Katie stood at the central monitor bank at 2:15, the glow of 3 patient screens casting her face in shades of blue and green. ICU Bay 7 held a sepsis case, still fighting, oxygen sat holding at 94%. Bay 9 was post-op, stable, breathing easy on minimal support. Bay 11 was Captain James Reeves. His chest rose and fell in the steady rhythm of the ventilator, the rhythm of a man sleeping without dreams, without memory of the woman standing 3 feet away. His name was still there on her forearm in faded ink, Morrison, a tattoo from a day when he'd known exactly who she was. She adjusted his sedation drip, checked the numbers, documented everything. The fluorescent lights above hummed their constant electronic meditation. The night nurse supervisor was gone. Coverage area expanded to 2 units tonight because of the flu outbreak ravaging the ICU staff. Katie was alone with 13 beds, and 3 of them were acute. This was what she'd become, a woman who moved through hospitals like a ghost, visible but unremembered, competent but invisible. Hands that had once stopped arterial bleeds in Helmand Province now refilled 4 bags and charted vitals with meticulous precision. The smallest life, the quietest existence. That was the plan. That was survival. 2:37 came without warning. The monitor's alarm shattered the soft darkness, not the gentle notification tones, but the aggressive 3-beat cascade that meant deterioration. Katie's head snapped toward the screen before the sound finished its first cycle. Captain Reeves' oxygen saturation was dropping. 94, 89. 86, his respiratory rate was climbing, 15 breaths, 18, 22, but his chest wasn't moving. The ventilator was cycling air in, but something was preventing it from getting where it needed to go. She moved. The supply room could wait. The paperwork could wait. The careful invisible existence could wait. Her hands were moving toward his bed the way they'd moved under mortar fire, the way they'd moved through the chaos of field triage, with the kind of muscle memory that transcended 12 years and 3,000 miles. She was at his bedside in 4 seconds. Tension pneumothorax. The recognition came not as a thought but as a fact, written in his dropping oxygen and his silent mouth and the way the ventilator was working against a collapsed lung that wasn't inflating properly. The collapsed lung was pushing on his heart like a fist in a closed box, suffocating everything. On-call physician was 20 minutes out, unreachable, somewhere between a house call and a dinner reservation, and Captain Reeves was dying in real time. The on-call number on the unit phone rang through to voicemail. Dr. Hammond, this is Oak Creek ICU. We have a patient in acute respiratory distress. Please call back immediately. She hung up before finishing. He was 20 minutes away. Captain Reeves had 4. Katie's eyes moved to the crash cart. Everything she needed was in that cart. Everything she'd ever needed to save a life was in that cart, and it had been for 3 years, waiting behind the badge that didn't mention Navy, waiting behind the name that belonged to no one anymore. Pain is data. Pain is information. A collapsed lung pressing on a heart is a problem with one answer. She opened the kit on the crash cart with the same efficiency she'd used opening first aid bags in a fire zone. 14-gauge needle. She couldn't afford to hesitate. She couldn't afford to call for someone else. She couldn't afford to be invisible while a man she'd carried 3 miles through enemy fire died on a ventilator. His chest wall. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. That was the geography of salvation. Her fingers found the landmarks on his chest, rib, intercostal space, skin. The antiseptic smell of the alcohol swab mixed with something metallic in her own mouth. Not fear. Clarity. This was clarity. This was what happened when everything else fell away. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping came like a gasp, pressure releasing, the sound of a pneumothorax deflating, the sound of a man coming back from the edge. The monitor shifted. His oxygen saturation climbed. 88, 92, 95, 97. His respiratory rate dropped as the ventilator finally had space to work, as his lungs finally had room to expand. His chest rose and fell, and the rhythm was there, the rhythm that meant he was going to keep breathing, that meant his heart wasn't being crushed anymore. Katie's hands were absolutely steady. That was the thing people never understood about combat training. The hands didn't shake because the hands understood what the mind was still learning, that certainty and action were the only antidotes to chaos. She secured the needle with tape, already moving toward the medication logs, already thinking 3 steps ahead. She was documenting the procedure, 0.4 to 15 ml of air aspirated from pleural space, patient saturation stabilized to 97%, bilateral breath sounds now equal and clear, heart rate normalized to 82, when the supply room door opened behind her. Dr. Hargrove stood in the doorway. He was still dressed, which meant he'd been called in, which meant someone had documented something that required the chief of surgery to make an appearance at 2:42 in the morning. His eyes moved from Katie to the crash cart to the needle kit she'd left at Captain Reeves' bedside. He didn't raise his voice. That was the thing about Hargrove, he didn't need to. The quiet was worse. You're suspended pending investigation. Katie turned from the computer screen. Her hands were folded on the desk. Her face was still. What? You performed an invasive medical procedure without physician oversight. Needle decompression is outside your scope of practice. It's a fireable offense, actually, but we're going to be generous and call it suspension while we investigate. He stepped closer, his presence filling the supply room the way a predator fills a cage, confident, unbothered by the rules that bound smaller things. Your badge and ID. Now. She removed them. 3 years of identification, 3 years of legitimacy, 3 years of the careful lie that had kept her invisible and therefore safe. The badge was plastic and cheap, the photo a woman who looked tired. She'd never looked at the photo before. Now she was forced to. The woman in that photo belonged to Oak Creek Memorial. The woman in that photo had a name that had been on a naval hospital roster once, then disappeared into the gap of years when Katie Morrison had tried to become someone else. Katie handed the badge to Hargrove. Her voice was level, measured, still the voice of a nurse, not yet the voice of what she'd been. Captain Reeves would have died without that procedure. That's what the investigation will determine. Hargrove didn't look at Captain Reeves. He didn't look at the monitor showing stable vitals. He was looking at Katie with the expression of a man who had just solved a problem that had been troubling him for weeks. You can go home. We'll be in touch about the formal hearing. Don't come back to the unit. Actually, don't come back to the hospital at all until we contact you. He closed the door before she finished putting on her jacket. By 8:38 that morning, the first call had already gone out. Hargrove sat in his office with the door closed, his phone to his ear, his voice smooth and concerned. Yes, I understand you're a busy man. This will only take a minute. We have a significant liability issue that just came to light. One of our nurses, Katie Morrison, performed an emergency needle decompression, that's a surgical procedure, without physician authorization or oversight. She claimed the on-call physician was unavailable, but protocol clearly states that a nurse cannot, under any circumstances, perform invasive procedures. He paused, letting the weight settle. I'm concerned about what else she might have done in 3 years of employment here. It's quite possible she's been practicing beyond her scope for a long time. We're looking at negligent suits, licensing violations, possibly criminal charges. By 10:30, the calls to Katie's references had begun. Hargrove's voice on the phone to the director of the small community clinic where Katie had worked after leaving the Navy was gentler, almost sympathetic. I'm just trying to establish a pattern. Did Ms. Morrison ever show signs of instability during her time with you? Trauma symptoms, perhaps? Anxiety? Any incidents where her judgment seemed compromised? The clinic director, a woman named Patricia Chen, hesitated before answering. Katie was one of our best nurses. She was quiet, but incredibly competent. Yes, quiet. Hargrove was nodding on the other end of the line, though no one was there to see it. That's often how it presents. Quiet people can hide a lot, can't they? Unprocessed trauma, for instance. Was she ever, in your experience, someone who overstepped her authority? By noon, Dr. Patricia Vance, an outside medical consultant with no connection to Oak Creek Memorial except through Hargrove's network, had already begun her review. 3 years of charts, every single one Katie had touched. 3 years of vital signs, medication administrations, clinical notes, all of it carefully, perfectly documented in a handwriting that was almost architecturally precise. Vance made notes on her legal pad. Competent, but suspiciously so. A pattern of anticipating physician orders before they were written. A pattern of catching complications early, sometimes very early. A pattern of a nurse who seemed to know what she was doing, which was exactly the problem. She's practicing medicine without a license, Vance would tell Hargrove later that day, over lunch that was billed to Oak Creek Memorial's consultant fund. Not explicitly, but practically. She's a liability. Sarah Reeves had tried to visit Katie at her apartment that morning. The complex was a 1-bedroom in Ocean Beach, the kind of place where no one asked questions and the rent was paid by automatic withdrawal from an account that had very little in it. Sarah had knocked on the door with flowers, actual flowers, roses, the kind of thing you brought to someone who'd saved your father's life. Katie didn't answer. She was already gone. The apartment was empty except for three things: the bed, the bathroom mirror, and the pair of worn combat boots at the bottom of the closet, the ones that had seen Helmand Province and 24 firefights, and the day she'd carried a man named James Reeves 3 miles with a collapsed lung. She looked at those boots for a long time before closing the closet door and walking out without locking it behind her. The hospital administrator would find her file that afternoon, a thin, almost insubstantial thing. Catherine and Morrison, hired 3 years ago, previous employment at a small community clinic in San Diego, previous employment gap of 2 years listed as family leave, no military service listed, no emergency contacts, no next of kin. There were no decorations in her file. No awards. No evidence of anything but a quiet woman with a steady hand and a talent for keeping patients alive. Hargrove reviewed the file with satisfaction. Just a nurse. Just someone who'd gotten in over her head, who'd watched too many medical dramas and decided she could perform procedures, who probably had some kind of trauma background. They usually did, the quiet ones. No one who'd be missed. No one with connections. No one with any kind of institutional power or recognition. He didn't know that Katie had spent 3 years in deliberate erasure, that her family still thought she was stationed at Naval Station San Diego with the fleet, that she sent emails from a fake APO address every 2 weeks to maintain the lie. He didn't know that the downcast eyes and the trembling in certain moments were the cost of survival, not weakness. He didn't know that a woman had stood at the bedside of a man who once knew her name and performed a procedure that only the rank of senior chief petty officer could have taught her, and done it with the certainty of someone who had already survived worse. The rain started at 2 p.m., hammering the parking lot like applause for a performance no one had seen. By morning, the calls had already started. Dr. Hargrove sat in his office with his door closed, phone pressed to his ear, voice smooth as oil on water. Board member Patricia Chen listened as he described Katie Morrison in careful, measured tones, a nurse who had stepped beyond her scope, who had performed procedures reserved for physicians, who showed signs of instability and possible delusion. He didn't say she'd saved a man's life. He said she'd overstepped catastrophically, and the liability exposure was staggering. Patricia asked for specifics. He provided them with the precision of someone who'd practiced the narrative. By 9 o'clock, 3 board members had heard variations of the same story. By noon, it had metastasized into something more dangerous than any single accusation. It had become doubt. Doubt that spread like sepsis through the administrative structure of Oak Creek Memorial. Dr. Vance, the outside consultant brought in to review Katie's charts, sat in a coffee shop near the hospital with a folder of documentation spread across a corner table. He'd been hired to find evidence of negligence, overreach, incompetence, something to justify termination. Instead, what stared back at him from page after page of meticulously charted medication administrations, vital sign monitoring, and clinical observations was the work of someone who caught errors before they became disasters. Her documentation had prevented at least 3 potential medication interactions by other staff members. Her notation of subtle vital sign changes had triggered early interventions that likely saved lives. Her charts read like the work of a trauma surgeon, not a floor nurse. Dr. Vance made a phone call to Dr. Hargrove. "The charts are actually impeccable," he said quietly. "I can't find any evidence of malpractice or overreach. If anything, her documentation prevented 3 potential medication errors by other staff." The line went silent. Then Hargrove hung up. At the community clinic in National City where Katie had worked after her discharge, clinic director Margaret Foster received a call from someone claiming to verify Katie's employment history. The caller's tone suggested he was fishing for something: patterns of insubordination, evidence of psychological instability, reports of erratic behavior. Margaret had hired Katie 5 years ago based on her credentials and her quiet competence, and she'd kept her for 2 years before Katie requested a transfer to Oak Creek Memorial. Katie Morrison was an exemplary employee, Margaret said flatly. No disciplinary issues. No absences. No problems whatsoever. The caller thanked her and hung up before she could say more. He'd gotten what he needed, not confirmation of wrongdoing, but the absence of any substantive complaint, which meant he would have to create one. Dr. Hargrove sat at his desk on Wednesday morning and began drafting an amendment to Katie Morrison's personnel file. His fingers moved across the keyboard with the certainty of someone who understood that documentation could be manufactured, that the right combination of words and dates could construct a narrative of incompetence that had never actually occurred. He fabricated a disciplinary action from Katie's time at the community clinic, a report of inappropriate medication handling dated 3 years ago, backdated carefully so it would have predated her hire at Oak Creek. He added vague language about concerns raised by supervising physicians regarding clinical judgment. He created a pattern where none existed. He was building the architecture of her destruction one keystroke at a time, and he believed absolutely that he would not be stopped. He didn't know that an unmarked sedan had been parked across the street from Oak Creek Memorial for 6 weeks, and that 2 FBI agents named Linda Torres and Marcus Webb had been documenting every call Hargrove made, every meeting he attended, every supply chain irregularity in the hospital's surgical equipment budget. 3 days after her suspension, Katie Morrison stood in the rain at Miramar National Cemetery, the mud beneath her feet the color of old blood. The headstone read Benjamin Morrison, Hospital Corpsman 2nd Class, U.S. Navy, 1985 to 2013. Below the dates, a single engraved anchor. The pair of worn combat boots she'd kept hidden in a closet for 3 years now sat mud-splattered at her feet. She'd pulled them from the darkness that morning without really understanding why, and now they felt like an accusation written in leather and salt stains. The rain fell in sheets, hammering the cemetery grass like applause for a performance no one had seen. Katie knelt in front of the stone, her scrub soaked through, and pressed both hands against the engraved letters of her husband's name. "I thought I could just save people quietly, Ben," she whispered. Her voice sounded like something broken coming back together. "I thought if I disappeared, if I became nobody, the nightmares would stop. I thought I could carry the weight and nobody would have to know about it." She took a breath that caught in her throat. "But I failed him again. Captain Reeves. I had his name on my chest when I carried him out of Helmand, and now he has my name on his arm, and he doesn't even know who I am. I saved his life twice and both times I lost myself doing it." Her hands trembled against the stone, not from cold, but from the force of holding everything in for 3 years. "And now I failed him a 3rd time. They're going to bury me in paperwork instead of dirt, and he's still going to be a stranger to me." A helicopter passed overhead, the rotor wash so loud it swallowed her voice. Katie dropped to both knees, gasping, her hands clawing at the mud. The sound took her back to Helmand, to the moment when rescue was close enough to touch, and it crushed her under its weight. She stayed there for 40 minutes, rain streaming down her face, mixing with tears, breathing in ragged bursts until her nervous system remembered that she was alive, that the war was over, that the helicopter was just a helicopter. When she finally stood, her hands were covered in mud and her voice, when she spoke, was barely audible. "I'm sorry, Ben. I'm sorry I couldn't fix this." Back at Oak Creek Memorial, Dr. Hargrove hit save on the falsified personnel amendment and sat back in his chair with the expression of a man who had solved a problem. The amended file would be filed in the morning, creating a documented pattern of misconduct that predated her current employment. It would justify her termination. It would destroy any chance of her finding work at another hospital. It would remove the liability, remove her. He poured himself 2 fingers of scotch at 11 in the morning and allowed himself to smile. He didn't notice the 2 FBI agents parked in the visitor lot, photographing his car as it pulled out of the hospital. He didn't know that his communications with the board members had been flagged by a HIPAA compliance algorithm 3 weeks ago. He didn't know that Katie Morrison's suspension had become a data point in a larger investigation into medical billing fraud that now included 3 hospitals, 2 pharmaceutical company executives, and approximately $4,800,000 in false claims. He only knew that he had one. The rain continued for 2 more hours. At Miramar Cemetery, the mud settled deeper, and nobody came to find her. The man wheeled into the ICU on a Tuesday morning arrived with a cardiac episode and a face Katie Morrison hadn't seen in 12 years. Ahmed Khalil was 47 now, his beard shot through with grey, his chest wrapped in monitoring electrodes, but when his eyes found hers across the nurse's station, something shifted in the air between them. He'd been Taliban when she treated him in Helmand Province, caught in coalition crossfire, bleeding out from a shrapnel wound that should have killed him. She'd stopped his bleeding anyway, her hands moving on muscle memory forged in chaos, even as he spat at her through broken teeth. Now, in a hospital room in San Diego under fluorescent lights that hummed their electronic drone, he looked at her with recognition that seemed to bypass his conscious mind entirely. His lips moved, struggling with English words his body knew better than his voice. "You," he whispered. "Helmand. You save." Katie's hands froze mid-documentation. The pen she was holding became suddenly very heavy. She didn't move. Didn't acknowledge. Kept her eyes on the monitor readout as if Ahmed Khalil was just another patient, just another set of vital signs requiring attention. But her heartbeat climbed, 85, 90, 95, and she could feel it the way a hunted animal feels the predator's gaze. Recognition was the most dangerous thing in a hospital where she'd spent 3 years learning how to be invisible. Captain James Reeves' daughter was sitting in his room when Katie came to check his post-op status. Sarah Reeves was 24, midshipman at the Naval Academy, her uniform dress blues pressed sharp as a knife edge, and she'd been scrolling through her phone when she overheard Ahmed's broken English echo down the corridor. Katie watched her freeze, then watched her stand slowly and move to the doorway, piece something together behind her eyes that shouldn't have been peaceable. "Wait," Sarah said quietly, stepping into the hallway. "You're a senior chief." The question landed like a hand on Katie's shoulder. Not aggressive. Just certain. Katie turned to face her, and in that moment she understood that invisibility wasn't a choice anymore, it was a luxury she no longer possessed. "Your father has her name tattooed on his arm," Sarah continued, not accusatory, just stating facts the way military people do. "I've asked him 1,000 times about that tattoo. He could never explain it. But you were in Helmand Province." It wasn't a question the second time either. Commander Rick Vasquez of SEAL Team 5 walked through the hospital doors at 14:32 that same afternoon, and everything that followed happened with the velocity of something that had been wound tight for years finally releasing. He wore dress blues with the collar devices of a senior officer, and the way the hospital staff moved around him, sudden deference, sudden clarity that rank had arrived, made it clear he wasn't here to visit a patient. He was here because Ahmed Khalil had spent the morning making phone calls, because the 6 men Katie had pulled out of that firefight in Helmand Province had spent 12 years knowing exactly where she was, because some bonds transcend discharge papers and new identities. Vasquez found Katie in the break room where she was pretending not to exist between vital sign checks. "Senior Chief Morrison," he said, and the title hung in the air like a salute. "Your cover just got blown by a Taliban fighter and a midshipman. Also, the FBI is about to have a very public conversation with Dr. Hargrove about wire fraud, and your name is going to come up. I thought you should know." Katie didn't respond. Just stared at the cold coffee in her hands like it might tell her what to do next. Vasquez continued anyway, because he was a commander and the room was his to own. Navy Cross recipient who turned down a battlefield commission. 2 silver stars. Purple Heart twice. Medical discharges don't usually include those kinds of decorations, Senior Chief, which means you never actually took a discharge. You just disappeared. He sat across from her, his presence taking up space like gravity. You were too busy keeping kids alive to sit at a desk, according to your file. So you became a nurse. A very good one, from what I'm hearing. The interrogation room on the 3rd floor became the stage where Dr. Hargrove's competence finally shattered into something desperate and small. FBI agents Torres and Kim laid out 8 months of investigation like a tactical operation, billing records for surgical supplies never used, invoices for implantable devices that never made it into patients, a $2.3 million pipeline of fraudulent claims routed through shell companies and back to 3 medical device representatives and the doctor who signed off on it all. The conspiracy had been elegant, too elegant to notice because hospital supply chains are deliberately complex, designed to be invisible, designed so no one person can see the whole machine. Until someone like Katie Morrison started charting with the precision of a combat medic, noting discrepancies between ordered supplies and actual procedures, asking questions that were quiet enough not to trigger defense mechanisms but accurate enough to create a pattern. Dr. Hargrove had needed her gone. He'd needed her credibility destroyed. He'd forged a personnel document, a prior disciplinary action that never occurred, added to her file with metadata that led the FBI directly back to his office computer, back to him, back to the moment his desperation became evidence. Agent Torres slid photographs across the table. You tried to destroy a senior chief petty officer to cover insurance fraud. That was a mistake. Dr. Hargrove's attorney arrived and whispered something that made him stop speaking entirely. The silence in that room was the sound of a man understanding that competence and intelligence weren't the same thing as actually being untouchable, that networks and phone calls and kickback arrangements could evaporate the moment federal agents decided you were more valuable prosecuted than protected. They walked him out past the unit board where he'd posted Katie's reprimand. He didn't look at it. He didn't look at anything anymore, just let himself be guided by agents in windbreakers toward a black sedan, the kind of transport that doesn't end at hospitals, and Katie Morrison, standing invisible in the corner of the hallway, finally allowed herself to feel the weight of something that wasn't shame. An administrator named Reeves, no relation to the captain, pulled a file from a locked federal database and placed it on a desk in front of Katie. The file was thin. Most of the pages were redacted, marked with black bars like scars. What remained was enough: service number, discharge status, decorations listing, the official notation that Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Morrison, USN Medical Corps, had distinguished herself in combat operations and was hereby being offered reinstatement with full exoneration and retroactive pay adjustment. Katie read her own service number aloud, voice barely a whisper. N897 for 03. She'd almost forgotten it. The number belonged to someone who wore a uniform, someone who'd made decisions that saved lives and cost lives, someone who'd held a weapon and watched it work. That person was supposed to be buried under 3 years of scrub uniforms and break room silence. But bodies don't forget. Muscle memory doesn't care about new identities. Captain Reeves never fully recovered his memory of Helmand Province. The blast damage was too thorough, the trauma too deep. But when Sarah showed him the photographs and the citations and the after-action report that documented how a senior chief had carried him 3 miles through enemy fire with a collapsed lung, something in his body recognized her anyway. His heart rate dropped every time Katie came into his room. His blood pressure stabilized. His fight-or-flight response would reset itself. At the cellular level, he remembered her. 2 years later, Katie Morrison stood in an office that had her name on the door, title reading Director of Emergency Medical Services, and the woman who had spent 3 years refilling 4 bags and eating lunch alone was now the person responsible for the entire emergency response protocol at Oak Creek Memorial. Her desk faced a window overlooking San Diego, and on the wall behind her, finally mounted, finally visible, was a shadow box containing her Navy Cross. Below it, 2 silver stars. Below that, 2 purple hearts arranged in a neat row. And on a shelf below the decorations, polished until they gleamed like dark mirrors, sat the pair of combat boots her husband Benjamin had worn during their last deployment together, the boots she'd carried in the bottom of her locker for 3 years, the boots that were finally allowed to be seen. The hospital board asked her to speak at their annual donor gala. She stood at a podium in front of 300 people wearing dress blues she hadn't expected to ever wear again, and the room went so quiet you could hear the air conditioning cycling through the vents. I spent 3 years believing that without a uniform, I was just broken, Katie said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that doesn't need to be loud to be heard. I believed that heroism required a badge or a gun or a title. But I learned something different. You do not need a badge or a gun to be a warrior. You just need to be someone who refuses to walk away when everyone else does. You need to be someone who locks the door and keeps working. The applause started in the back row where a young Marine corpsman in dress blues stood at attention, saluting, one of the 6 men she'd pulled out of that firefight in Helmand Province, now a physician assistant student on his way to becoming a doctor. Katie returned the salute, and for the first time in 5 years, she slept through the night without the nightmares coming. If you want more stories about the quiet warriors walking among us, the ones who've seen the worst and give the most, subscribe now and hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode. Like this video if you believe that true heroism doesn't require fame. And in the comments, tell us, have you ever been completely wrong about someone you thought you knew?